of everything. Fire spreading all around my room. My world's so bright, it's hard to breathe, but that's alright. Hush.
Hello, my name is Ariel and welcome to my channel. This is the first part of a new series that I'm calling A Healthy Fear of Monsters. It's going to focus on true crime and missing persons cases. If you're interested in this kind of content, please consider subscribing to my channel and hitting the like button to let me know that you're interested in seeing more. I'll always be looking for suggestions as to which cases you'd like to see going forward. I don't know how often I'll get these videos done. It really depends on the interest and demand. But I do intend to keep doing them going forward because I do have a real passion for the true crime genre in a way that goes far beyond just entertainment. I consider them to be educational, and in the case of unsolved cases, I really believe that getting these cases more coverage and putting them out into the world can have an impact on how likely they are to get solved. So the case that I'm going to be starting with is a case that really means something to me. I've been following it for a while and it's really stuck with me. But a few years ago, I considered starting a true crime podcast. And when I started thinking about that, I looked into different unsolved cases that weren't getting enough coverage, in my opinion, because I wanted to start with that if I was going to start with anything at all. This case really got lodged in my mind. From then on, I started looking into it every so often. For a long time, I didn't see anything changing. Recently, I looked into it again, and I was thrilled to see that there had finally been a great deal of movement on the case. There was a suspect in custody, and I was really relieved to hear that. But even though this case is now allegedly solved, I still think it's important to cover. Minorities and members of the LGBTQ community are all too often invisible in death, as they sometimes can be in life. The media isn't invested in those cases much of the time, and the public doesn't have the information that they need to help with those cases, even if the public is motivated to, which I do think increasingly is the case. When I researched this case, most of the information that I found, aside from really simple, direct, and kind of dry to the point reports, which there weren't even that many of, but most of what I found was on personal blogs or newspapers or news sites dedicated to specifically the LGBTQ community. And while I'm glad and think it's great that these sources do exist, at the same time, it's disheartening to find that the mainstream media still isn't putting the kind of coverage behind the cases of minorities and LGBTQ people that they put behind other types of cases. I don't know, it's just a little disturbing, but this is 2019, and we are now crowdsourcing media. With that said, I have all the respect in the world for the victim in this case, and also for the family and friends of the victim. I mean no offense to them in any capacity. The last thing I want to do is cause them any distress or additional pain. If I have done so by creating this video, I deeply and sincerely apologize. Finally, this case does contain some pretty disturbing subject matter. I'm not going to go into gory details, but if you are sensitive, please do skip the video. I really don't want to cause anybody any kind of distress or upset. Without further ado, let's get into the case of Rashawn Brazell. Rashawn Brazell was born on April 15, 1985, to his mother, Desire Brazell. I don't know anything about his biological father, but his mother was married to a man named Reginald Jones. The family lived on Gates Avenue in the Bedford-Stuyvesant area of Brooklyn in New York City, along with Desire's oldest son, Janata Brazell. Janata was 8 years older than Rashawn, so Rashawn was still fairly young when Janata moved to Massachusetts along with his girlfriend to start a new life in a new area. So this left Rashawn, Desire, and Reginald. I was not able to find information on what the relationship was like between Desire and Reginald or Reginald and Rashawn, but what I do know is that Rashawn and Desire were extremely close. According to Desire, if you saw one, you would frequently see the other very soon behind. They were like best friends. That closeness made it all the easier for Rashawn to live openly. Desire was not sure whether her son was bisexual or gay, but she did know that he dated men, and he did know that he didn't have to sneak around. In a 2019 context, this may not seem revolutionary, but remember, this case takes place in 2005. This was less than a year, only a few months after the 2004 election in which gay rights and gay marriage became a decisive issue that led to the re-election of George W. Bush and the Republican landslide in Congress. Please try to keep that environment in mind going forward in the discussion of the case. At the time, though, Rashawn was a busy young man. He was only 19 years old. He had a great love for life that shone through in his beautiful, bright smile. He was handsome, charming, charismatic, and ambitious. He worked 4 jobs to make ends meet, all the while keeping his eyes toward his future goals. He dreamed of being a web designer or perhaps going into the fashion industry. In fact, just a few weeks before his death, he had been working as a runway model in fashion show. And while he had great dreams, his loving heart and charitable nature kept him grounded. He had a neighbor that lived across the street, and Desire didn't realize this until after his death, but Rashawn had taken food from their own refrigerator and brought it to the family across the street. He had also given his own shoes to the boy across the street because he didn't have proper shoes to wear. Rashawn loved to cook. He loved music. He loved hanging out with his friends, who called him the life of the party. He loved everyone, they said, and he was always all smiles. Tariq King, a filmmaker behind the documentary Rashawn's Desire, the untold story of Rashawn Brazell, said that he had a blind spot when it came to how evil people could be. On Valentine's Day 2005, however, Rashawn wasn't thinking about any of that. He had an appointment with an accountant to get his taxes done, and then he intended to meet his mother in Manhattan for lunch. At 7:30 in the morning, Desire had already left for work. She was employed as a caseworker at a local homeless shelter, so Rashawn called her there, made arrangements for their lunch date, and got ready to go to the accountant. This was the last time that Desire would ever speak to her son. What happened next is a little bit muddy. Some people report that Rashawn simply left the house and went to the train station. Others say that an unidentified man rang the buzzer at his apartment. Rashawn came downstairs to meet him outside, at which point these two left together. Either way, Rashawn was headed to the elevated J station on Gates Avenue. I did see one source mention that it was believed that Rashawn got onto the train with this unidentified man and that they got off at Nostrand Avenue on the A line. That's notable for reasons that we'll get into in a minute, but mostly I've seen people say that it was not clear whether or not Rashawn actually got onto the train. So as I mentioned, Rashawn was on his way to get his taxes done. When he didn't make this appointment, alarm bells were slightly raised. They became very raised when he missed his lunch date with Desire. Relatives reported him missing that day, but police response was sluggish for several reasons. Rashawn was a legal adult. He was 19 years old. And as anyone who follows true crime or even just the news would probably know, police can often be reluctant to open an investigation in an adult's disappearance before 24 to 72 hours have passed, or even then sometimes. Often they just assume that the person went off on their own. They chose to disappear. They were unhappy with their life and they went off to start a new life. It's not illegal for a person to go missing if they want to. Often it's very difficult to persuade them to leave this idea behind, even if the family or friends or both are saying that it's very unlike this person to just disappear that way. So obviously in Rashawn's case, the idea that he had just gone missing on his own wouldn't really ring true. He had made an appointment with Desire for lunch that very day. He was on his way to the accountant's, and while he had a lot of pressures in his life, he was already looking forward to pursuing his goals. But aside from his age, there was also the issue of his criminal record. Now, Rashawn had not been involved in any kind of violent crime or even really major crimes, but he did have an arrest on his record for a minor marijuana offense. Now remember that, again, this is 2005, so at the time, marijuana was still being actively pursued as a major drug charge. It was not being legalized in any of the states, and police really took marijuana very seriously. I assume that the police, upon seeing that this person was an adult, had a arrest record for drugs, they probably assumed that he was just off doing whatever it is that young drug people do. They probably just assumed that he was off doing his thing. And finally, there is the issue of his race and sexuality. This was a major point of contention at the time, as many of the African American community and the gay community believed that if he were white or straight, then the case may have been solved earlier. Now, I would just like to go on the record to say that Desire has said that her experience with the police was extremely positive. She didn't have any complaints about this, and I personally think that his age and his arrest record were probably larger deciding factors than his race or sexuality, but we can't deny that these factors can bias an investigation, even if it isn't the detectives who actually did the investigating. Maybe it was a factor in deciding when the investigation was opened. I really couldn't say for sure, but that was definitely a concern that people had at the time. In the end, it didn't matter because it would be only a few days before it became obvious that Rashawn was not fine. February 17th, 2005. 2 transit workers caught sight of one large black trash bag and one black bag with wheels labeled Rooster in the tunnel between Franklin Avenue and Nostrand Avenue on the A line. So this was still relatively recently after 9/11, and people were still on high alert for any kind of terrorist activity. That in mind, the transit workers immediately went to look and see what it was that they had found. Inside the wheeled bag, they found blood, tools, and bloody drill bits. Inside the black trash bag, there was another trash bag, this one blue, and inside the blue trash bag, there were the dismembered remains of an African-American man. The bag did not contain the entire body, but investigators were able to use the man's fingerprints to determine that these were the remains of Rashawn Brazell. Soon thereafter, additional remains were located in New York City's Hummel Street recycling plant. This center was often used to discard of subway trash. Rashawn's body had been dismembered using a sharp instrument initially, and then a chainsaw. His head was never found. The state of his remains made it impossible to determine an exact cause of death, but he had suffered stab wounds and slash wounds, which suggested that Rashawn had fought for his life. Investigators also believe that Rashawn may have been held captive for up to 2 days after his disappearance and before his murder. Because of the precision of the cuts, early on, investigators believed that a doctor or butcher may have been responsible for Rashawn's death. Alternately, they thought it may have been a transit worker because the location of the bags was not obvious. They believed that somebody who was not familiar with the subway station and the tunnels would not have thought to put them there. Additionally, the bag labeled Rooster had been manufactured by the hardware store Lowe's. It was one of 15 prototypes that had been sold to the MTA and given to transit workers to test. So initially they're thinking that it may have been a butcher, a doctor, or a transit worker, but these theories were all discarded by the time the 1 year later reports began to appear. I'm not really sure what it was that made them discard those theories. Maybe they just couldn't find anybody who fit that profile who they believed may have been involved. Police believed that Rashawn's killer may have been a casual hookup or a lover. There were rumors that he had been killed by a sexual partner who was in conflict about his sexuality and had taken out his self-hatred on Rashawn. Family and friends said that Rashawn had been recently looking to cut certain toxic individuals out of his life, that he was making changes going forward, and he had changed his phone number in an attempt to distance himself from people who were making his life more difficult. So perhaps someone that he had chosen to remove from his life had reacted violently. Either way, neither the police nor Rashawn's family and friends believed that this had been a random attack. They believed that Rashawn had known his attacker. For a long time, Desire left Rashawn's room untouched as a memorial to her lost son. Meanwhile, Rashawn's community mourned. The blogosphere began to talk about him, black gay bloggers expressing their frustration. Rashawn's case was barely being reported on by the mainstream press, despite how horrific his murder had been. Many only found out about it by reading the personal blogs of other gay men. Soon, heartbreaking post after heartbreaking post began appearing on these blogs. Many of them were from personal friends and acquaintances of Rashawn's, demanding to know, where were the cries for justice? Where was the outrage? Why wasn't he getting any kind of real media coverage? A shining light of a man had been killed at only 19 years old, and it seemed like nobody really cared except for them. In one of the few posts surviving to this day, Larry Lyons says, "Every day I read these sites and scan these papers. Every one of them a snapshot. A black boy, handsome and well-liked, never making it to his destination. Maybe God was saving you the pain of writing elegy to the next Rashawn Brazell, the next ambitious young man to go from best friend to body parts in the space of a weekend." Elsewhere, Lyons writes, "Please acknowledge that we are more than just some chopped up body parts that litter your subway. We are a life and a son and a friend and a lover. We may not have risen to the social heights at which the media moves from being bloodthirsty shock jocks to being empathetic and conscientiously respectful. But goddammit, we demand the cries for decency, visibility, and justice that would surely be afforded to our white straight counterparts." In response, a commenter called Merv says, "We knew this would happen in terms of coverage, and we have to honor him and the others, here and elsewhere, with our words and our love." In May of 2005, only months after Rashawn's murder, Desire began receiving threatening messages taunting her. These would continue around either the anniversary of his death or around his birthday for years. These messages urged her to give up the search for her son's murderer and threatened that if she did not, she might join him. Rashawn's brother Janata received a call stating that, like his brother, he would be dead by summer. In response, Janata began to carry a loaded weapon. Eventually, this would lead to his being arrested on charges of felony possession of a loaded firearm. Once a scholarship fund had been established in Rashawn's name, the executor of the scholarship fund also began to receive these threatening messages. Nevertheless, no violence ever actually occurred, so it is unclear whether this was connected to Rashawn's death or if it was just a really sick prank. And then, the case went cold. Detective Richard Amato, the lead on Rashawn's case, would for years go to Pride, handing out flyers, asking questions, and looking for leads. The case was featured 4 times on America's Most Wanted, but nothing came of it. Desire fled to Georgia, but eventually Richard Amato called her and told her she had to return to Brooklyn. They still had work to do. Desire agreed. She had to return to New York and continue to fight for her son. But that battle stretched on for years. Brazell wrote poems to memorialize her son, with his bright smile and his swagger and his kind heart.
"I think of you like Grandma molasses and biscuits. I wish this poem didn't have to start like this. Wish this poem wouldn't cause me to say things like this. Today, I'm really missing you, really thinking about you, your scent. Sometimes summertime reminds me of him. Hummingbirds singing on the north side of the sun for him, for him."
In time, Detective Amato retired, but he left the case in 2 extraordinarily good hands. Jason Palomara and Evelyn Gutierrez were 2 cold case detectives, and according to Desire, they welcomed her with open arms and immediately got to work on this case. Desire kept hoping and believing that there would be justice for her son. Even so, as months became years, became a decade, became more, it seemed that Rashawn, who had once said that he wanted to be remembered for great things, would instead be remembered as a bag of body parts. The worst case scenario. 2016. It had been 10 years since the murder of 16-year-old honor student Chanel Petro-Nixon. Petro-Nixon was a Bedford-Stuyvesant resident who set out on Father's Day of 2006 to meet a friend with the intention of filling out a job application at a local Applebee's. She never made it to the restaurant, and she never made it home. Days later, her remains would be found stuffed into a trash bag and discarded on a street corner. The cause of death was strangulation, and the police had suspicions, but no evidence. The case lingered for a decade before being resolved when the authorities charged Varen Primus with her murder. Primus was a school friend of Chanel's, and in fact was the friend that Chanel was meeting that day to go to Applebee's and fill out this job application. He had long been the main suspect, in part because he had been the last person to see her. Even aside from that, it wasn't terribly surprising that he was charged with murder, because at the time that he was charged, he was already in custody on Rikers Island for an unrelated murder. So this meant that Primus had already been charged in 2 separate murders. Police decided to investigate cases that were reminiscent of Chanel Petro-Nixon's murder, in case he was responsible for any other deaths. One name that came to mind immediately was Sharabia Thomas. Sharabia was another resident of the Bedford-Stuyvesant area, the same area in Brooklyn where Chanel Petro-Nixon and Rashawn Brazell had resided. She was a 17-year-old high school student with aspirations aspirations of becoming a fashion designer, and she disappeared on February 11th of 2004 as she made her way from her home to the location of a school field trip. Later that day, her naked and dismembered body was discovered stuffed into 2 laundry bins in an alley near her Palmetto Street home. Sharabia's wrists were marked with restraint burns. She had been badly beaten and suffered blunt force trauma, but the cause of death had been asphyxiation due to neck pressure. Seeing a possible link between Sarabia and Chanel, investigators tested male DNA extracted from beneath Sharabia's fingernails, which had been deposited there as she fought for her life. They waited, and they found a match, but not to Veron Primus. The sample matched another man entirely, a man named Qujoto Gavan. At the time, Qujoto was nearing the end of a 3-year sentence in Florida where he had committed an armed robbery with a BB gun and stolen a can of beer. As a routine part of his arrest, his DNA had been collected and updated to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a system that allows law enforcement to compare DNA samples across states. Once Qujoto was identified as the primary suspect in Sharabia's murder, police began looking into his past. They found that he had once resided on Gates Avenue, just across the street from another victim in another homicide long since gone cold. Desire was in downtown Brooklyn, shopping at the Gap, when she received a phone call from authorities. She fell to her knees even before they had given her the news. They had found a suspect in Rashawn's murder after 13 years. So, who was Qujoto Gavan? Commonly called Qua, Qujoto grew up across the street from the Brazells. I'm not sure if he's the one that Rashawn gave the food and shoes to. I'm assuming that he wasn't, because I feel like that would have been mentioned if he were. Desire had known Qujoto and his family for years. She said she watched him grow up, and she was shocked when she found out that he was the suspect. Qujoto seemed normal growing up. He was a little bit moody. At one point, he was arrested for carrying a ninja star in his pocket. Speaking as somebody who grew up in New York City, a lot of people had ninja stars that they were just carrying around at the time. Some of the people I went to school with just had ninja stars in their pockets, so I really wouldn't read that much into it. As a young man, Qujoto was sometimes seen walking around shirtless with a snake draped around his neck. Supposedly, this was a massive snake. It was described as around the size of a banister. At times, he also wore contact lenses that made his eyes resemble that of a snake. Now, I don't think that these things are related to his being a murderer. That said, he enjoyed exercising domination and feeling power over people and feeling that he was inspiring fear in others. So the giant snake and the contact lenses are probably related to that. His first arrest was in 1996 when he served a 30-day sentence in juvenile hall for grand larceny. As an adult, he worked in maintenance and sometimes he worked in security, and twice he was caught stealing from either his company or their clients, in one case trying to pawn off the equipment that he'd stolen. At some point, Qujoto married and had children. It was said that he was moody, but he was a perfectly fine father. Even so, at some point before he was charged with Sharabia's murder, his marriage fell apart due to his violence and some infidelities. I'm not sure if it was him or his wife that was unfaithful. But his wife was not the only one to witness his violent tempers. He had pulled a gun on neighbors on several occasions as well. When confronted by authorities about his potential role in Sarabia and Rashawn's murders, he grabbed his head and screamed, "Oh no, I hope it didn't happen again." Subsequently, he claimed to be schizophrenic and to have multiple personalities. Later, police found a notebook in his possession with 4 pages of crude sketches for what he called a sex pod. In his own words, this was a lightweight carbon fiber tripod with leg strips and hand grips to pull the legs up and down, small enough to carry, but strong enough to hold a 200-pound person during sex. Qujoto was transferred to Rikers Island to face charges in Sharabia's murder, and once he was there, police questioned him about his connection to Rashawn Brazell. They found multiple inconsistencies in his story. It hasn't been specified what those inconsistencies were. Those will probably come out during the trial, but we can probably take an educated guess of at least one of them, because Qujoto claimed that because he was a Jehovah's Witness, he did not associate with anyone outside of his place of worship. He also claimed that he didn't know Rashawn, but according to somebody who was close to Qujoto at the time and who chooses to remain anonymous, Rashawn and his friends were at Qujoto's house frequently during those times right before his death. I obviously can't guarantee that that's true. That said, Janata Brazell mentioned that looking back, After Rashawn's murder, Kohoru began to hang around him and his friends. He even attended Rashawn's funeral and signed the guest book. If Kohoru's former friend is to be believed, this probably just came off as normal mourning at the time, but in retrospect, it's pretty disturbing. In February of 2017, the trial of Kohoru Gavan in the case of Sharabia Thomas began. Initially, he refused to be fingerprinted, which resulted in delays. When physically restrained, he began to rant and shout and demanded to know whether this is what President Trump would allow. Nevertheless, he was convicted of second-degree murder in the case of Sharabia Thomas and sentenced to the maximum of 25 years to life. That brings us to today. Despite his conviction in Sharabia's case, Kohoru Gavan continues to insist that he is innocent of both murders. He's been causing some issues. He recently attempted to fire his attorneys, Joshua Horowitz and Jonathan Strauss, claiming that Horowitz was not sharing information with him and that Strauss was playing Sudoku and taking naps during proceedings. In January of 2019, his request for new attorneys was denied by Judge Joanna Quinones, who stated that his attorney, Mr. Strauss, had not appeared to be sleeping at any time. Police believe that Kohoru Gavan was a serial killer. He is currently a person of interest in several other unsolved murders with unidentified victims whose death involved dismemberments. In one case, the John Doe victim was found stuffed into a trash bin. The trash bin originated from Gates Avenue. There are still a lot of questions. The motive for Sharabia's murder was likely sexual. Authorities have suggested that she may have been used to test the sex pod. But what about Rashawn? What possible reason could Kohoru have had? What possible reason could Kohoru have had to inflict such a violent, brutal murder on Rashawn Brazell? It may have been a hate crime. Kohoru did say that the reason that he was not familiar with Rashawn was that he was an abomination, according to the Bible. What about this second man whose existence remains unclear? Was there a second man at all? Perhaps the answers to these questions will come out during the trial, which is currently set to begin in spring of 2019. Rashawn Brazell was a handsome, good-natured, and loving young man whose life was brutally cut short, putting an end to all his infinite potential. His loss dimmed the light of Bedford-Stuyvesant and Gates Avenue all the more because he was not there to help his friends and family smile through the pain. Who could Rashawn have become if he had been permitted to see his 20th year and his 30th? What could he have done with that generous heart? Those hands that carried shoes to neighbors who would otherwise have gone without them and took food from his own mouth to share with the needy. Unfortunately, the world will never know the answers to these questions. But while it may be a distant second in terms of outcomes, at least now we can say that the long search has most likely come to an end, giving his friends and family the closure they deserve and the justice they have so long needed. Thank you for joining me for this inaugural episode of Healthy Fear of Monsters. Like I said, this case really stuck with me. This is actually the third time that I have recorded this video because I really wanted to get it right. So I hope I've done right by Rashawn. I'm so glad that this case seems to be coming to a close. I do intend to follow the case as it goes forward, so if any other information comes out or if anything really happens, I will be sure to bring that information to you. So about Tariq King's documentary, it was called Rashawn's Desire: The Untold Story of Rashawn Brazell. I haven't been able to confirm whether or not this was ever actually completed or released. I did see some advertisements for pre-screenings, but that was pretty much where it ended. There are some clips of it on YouTube if you want to look at some conversations that he had with Desire and with Rashawn's other friends and family. Also, there's an interview with Tariq King about why he did start the documentary. I'm going to try to link that below. I'm also going to link some other resources below. And if you have any other information on that documentary, if you know whether it was ever released or not, please do let me know below. Again, if you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting like and subscribing to my channel. Let me know your thoughts down below. Thoughts about the case, thoughts about the video itself. All I ask is that you be respectful. Also, you may notice the date. This is the anniversary of Rashawn's disappearance. So I really wanted to get this out to, I guess, memorialize him in my own little way. So thank you very much for being here, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.